Welcome to Now's Nonsense. Take a look at any typical American city. Sort of looks like this. Lots of big, tall skyscrapers. Take a look at the typical European city. Usually looks more like this. Way less skyscrapers. Now, why is this? Now, of course, there are some skyscrapers in Europe, don't get me wrong, but it is a substantially fewer number than in cities in North America or in Asia. So a skyscraper is generally considered to be a tower over 150 meters. There are reported 218 skyscrapers in Europe, with 66% of them being in just 5 cities: London, Paris, Frankfurt, Moscow, and Istanbul. Whereas there are 214 skyscrapers in New York alone. And in total, there are 639 skyscrapers across the United States. Random sort of run-of-the-mill cities in the United States. I mean, look, this is Cleveland. Cleveland. And that's in Ohio. And even Cleveland's got skyscrapers. So why is there this difference? Why does the United States and Asia seem to have way more skyscrapers in their cities than European cities? So the explanation is actually reasonably simple. So skyscrapers sort of started to become popular in the early 19th century. It started out in Chicago and then later moved to New York City. And these were sort of the first 2 cities to really popularize the skyscraper. But by this time, European cities were fully established. I mean, some of these settlements have been around for centuries. And these cities had their historic buildings and spaces, and there wasn't really room to put in this new invention, the skyscraper, into their downtown areas. In addition, most European cities were more evenly zoned, so there wasn't a demand to really stack people up on top of each other in a small area like that. There's also sort of this North American-European rivalry. Like, the United States was sort of aiming to become the new era of life, whereas Europe, the old world, had its traditions and its way of living, how its buildings looked, how its cities looked. So there's this little bit of rivalry between the 2 continents, and each one was sort of wary of adopting each other's styles. Then comes World War II, which devastated a lot of Europe and devastated so many European cities. And they had to be rebuilt. Actually, a lot of people thought that when they rebuilt these European cities, they sort of built them in this new modern American skyscraper style. But they didn't really do that. Instead, there was really this desire by the people in these places to rebuild what had been lost. I mean, there are these historic buildings that have been around for so long in some places, and so the desire was to kind of restore that traditional look to a lot of these cities. Some experts also say that because there was a lower population in Europe after World War II, that there wasn't a demand for these buildings that could really cram people into cities. So lower population led to lower demand for these types of structures. Then came along what is known as Brusselization. Essentially, in the 1960s, there weren't very strict zoning regulations. And then so in Brussels in the 1960s, all of these kind of ugly buildings were built within all of the historic buildings, and it really sort of damaged the aesthetic value of the skyline. Like, that doesn't look great. So after seeing sort of what happened to Brussels, a lot of architects coined this term, Brusselization, and they lobbied to introduce new planning and zoning rules to avoid this happening in other places. After this Brussels situation, a lot of city centers were declared historical areas, and they're unable to be developed in that modern way where you add these modern skyscraper-looking buildings. Now, since the 2000s, we've seen some of these financial districts in some cities like Frankfurt, London, Paris, Moscow, Istanbul build up some tall skyscrapers. But even in those events, like say, for example, in Paris, they designated a specific area where the skyscrapers would go, so it wouldn't sort of damage the historic skyline. It would all be in one place. And I do have to admit, I've been to Paris and I've kind of seen it. It just doesn't look great seeing this cool historic city and then these modern skyscrapers. It just doesn't really blend well, in my opinion. So I understand it. So in short, because most European cities were pretty well established and developed by the time the modern skyscraper started to take hold, they just didn't want to add those to their cities. In American cities, because they were developed later, a lot of them in the 20th century, after the skyscraper had become a thing, ended up having a lot of cities with skyscraper skylines. And after World War II, European cities wanted to keep their historical aesthetic for the most part, so they rebuilt to look older and traditional. Thank you for listening to my nonsense.